Hey, let's give people a minute or two to join. I just so you know, I added our creative director as a moderator, um, in case there are like interesting questions to field or problematic people.
Okay.
Um, so yeah. Um, hey everybody, thanks for joining. Um, Before we get started, I just wanted to um, say a quick thank you to everybody who has been supporting some of the grassroots local mutual aid throughout our region. Um, we've seen like an incredibly effective mobilization happening throughout our region, and we're kind of, it seems, at the beginning of a turning point. Um, a lot of the basic needs have been met, for now, at least, as it pertains to, food and water and PPE, and things like that. There are still some requests, some very specific requests coming out, from different organizations in different regions. So if you've found yourself particularly invested in a specific locale, I would just recommend tapping into those resources that are connected to that location and and being mindful about what specific needs are met or what specific needs are there right now. Um, yeah, so I guess without further ado, I'd like to get started with this interview. So today we're going to be talking about some matters pertaining to Asheville's water infrastructure, both some historic things that have occurred with Asheville's water infrastructure, and also, thinking about the collapse of Asheville's water infrastructure in the wake of Hurricane Helene. And we've got Grace here with us today. And Grace, if you want to maybe introduce yourself for people, and maybe give them a little kind of idea of what you were doing before the hurricane and what role you found yourself playing in your community since the hurricane.
Yeah. So I've been an Asheville resident for 18 years. And before the hurricane, I was involved most recently with working towards fighting a business improvement district in downtown Asheville, which is basically an extra tax that gets sent to a privatized entity, with some of our um, wealthiest hoteliers and private developers, where they would get to make big decisions about what happens in our community. And it was really looking like it was going to be another route of policing, particularly towards our unhoused neighbors, which is also an area that I've been working with, in terms of how our city, we are, I believe, like the most expensive place, well, we're the most expensive place to live in North Carolina here in Asheville. The gentrification post 2020 has been off the charts. This has been sold as a community, as a climate refuge
Right.
for folks all over the country. And as a result of that, a lot of people don't have, before the hurricane, didn't have their needs met, both who are housed and unhoused. And so worked a lot alongside that, and also just, yeah, the way that we are criminalizing poverty in our community. And there was also there was a long case that I did a lot with the Aston Park defendants,
Mhm.
who were charged with felony littering for basically saying stop the sweeps after after COVID. and their charges were recently dropped right before this hurricane. But, it's just important to be stated that our community has a history of also criminalizing people who try to help each other.
Hmm.
And obviously, we hope that would never happen
Right.
in a disaster like this. But I have a lot of context around that from firsthand experience.
Right. Right. And I know that you've spent some time as a concerned citizen, basically thinking through and about Asheville's water infrastructure prior to the hurricane. Can you maybe explain for us how you became interested in Asheville's water infrastructure, and then maybe give us a little bit of a recent history as you understand it, and as you've experienced it, of the kind of like insufficiency maybe of Asheville's water infrastructure.
So in January, or sorry, I guess it was actually Christmas Day of 2022, the city of Asheville experienced a massive water outage. There were really low freezing temperatures at that time, and much of the community was without water, particularly in Candler and the Shiloh community. And I was working on water distribution in that time. Of course, in that time we were distributing bottled water.
Right.
Um, I think I was out of town and then came back maybe 2 or 3 days after that. And I just watched that all play out firsthand. We no one in the city even communicated that the water was out initially. Then they said the water was back on when it wasn't on. There was no, like, it was again very similar to now. It was community members who were stepping up to distribute water.
Hmm.
I at the time I was actually on the phone because the city, with city officials being like, if you have a water supply, like we'll distribute it, and we were just trying to commandeer water anywhere we could get it. So then after all of that happened, then the city did like an after action report where they go and analyze this, and there were a lot of failures found along the way. I pulled up an article from that time, which from our local news that said the city of Asheville emergency manager within the fire department was not utilized and was identified as being prevented from performing his duties. Um,
Wow.
they also
What
they also
was
found
the
that
source on that?
that's just our local WLOS, like our
Okay,
local TV station.
gotcha.
Um, the report also found no incident documentation of the crisis was maintained throughout the duration of the incident, which prevented FEMA reimbursement.
Wow.
Um, the report found that city leaders and elected officials were consistently unable to identify who was in charge. So they, like, not only did the communicate, like setting aside like the water infrastructure piece,
Hmm.
which was a known issue, then they also like just didn't tell the community what was happening. And much like today, like community members stepped up and distributed water to their neighbors,
Right.
the way that, yeah. And I made a lot of beautiful connections during that time. I was really yeah, grateful to be a part of that, and also um came to understand like how I think like in much of the United States our infrastructure is crumbling.
Hmm.
And then in Asheville we have well, our main industry here is tourism. People are coming here from all over the country. Our I think our the 2025 budget for our tourism and development authority is $27 million. There have been people making calls in the community to say, we need to prioritize people who live here, obviously. And guess what? Tourists need water too,
Right.
as we're seeing now. And so there was all of that happening. And then since this incident, or actually, I'm going to step back to one other water
Hmm.
crisis, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, I moved here. My first time I visited Asheville was in 2005, and I came here in 2006. And in 2004, there had been a hurricane. I don't remember the name of it that had ripped through Biltmore Village here in town, and the water had been out in town for a week, and everyone was still talking about it. That area of town was still pretty destroyed from that when I moved here, and also the River Arts district that's all hip now was like cheap cheap property that artists were in or whatever because it's next to the river, but
Hmm.
then that has since been deeply gentrified. But I learned since then that and I had that the main line in 2004 had been knocked out, um and they went to the backup line, and then the backup and then we were only left with the backup line when we that was never replaced, so that was 20 years ago.
Right.
um so yeah, so
Oh,
there were
wow.
like a lot of known pieces, so it's both in like the I think the big, obviously there's the big picture, like why aren't we supporting our infrastructure question, why are we prioritizing all this money towards tourism and policing,
Hmm.
and then coupled with like after such a recent event of our city not having water,
Hmm.
like, and we spent all this time with all these meetings, there still, when this hurricane hit and water went out, as best I can tell, there was still no plan. There weren't reserves on stock. I think a lot about how many tear gas canisters we have in town versus how many bottles of water.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, that would be an interesting proportion to know, honestly.
I'm very curious.
Yeah, yeah. I just realized this is super random, but I just realized somehow I titled this Asheville's All Right Water Infrastructure. That must have been an autocorrect. Hazel's moderating. I don't know if you can change that title. I can't figure out how to do it, so we'll just leave it for now unless Hazel could change it.
Yeah, to be clear, we are not all right or all right.
Right, right. Yeah, very true. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that gives us a little bit of context for thinking about, the current matters that you all are facing, particularly in Asheville when it comes to water infrastructure. Um, and we can revisit some of that along the way if need be. But I'm curious, maybe to begin with on this last little bit of questions, if you could describe for us, as you understand it, what impacts Hurricane Helene had on Asheville's water infrastructure, and also what the current status of that infrastructure is, and if you've heard any news from the government.
So I'm going to do my best with this part, contextualizing that I've been reading the city's water updates, and yeah, doing my best to understand. So there's a North Fork Reservoir, which is basically in Black Mountain, which is about 20 minutes away, that supplies, I believe, 70% of all of the water to Asheville. And their their line was completely destroyed during this, and also there's so much sediment in the water from the storm that still hasn't settled. So I think they were like loading it down with chemicals to try to get that sediment to come down, and they're currently trying to straight pipe that water back into town.
Mm.
Um, which, they put out a video yesterday that basically said if turn off all of your hot water heaters, your unscrew your faucets, turn because like there's going to be so much sediment in, like if a house gets water,
Right.
then it is going to be filled with an incredible amount of sediment that could destroy your appliances,
Wow.
also like ice makers. And then they said like that that it would be a boil advisory, but like basically still really don't drink this water.
Wow.
And so, and that's far away. So like they, I think, have finally reconnected it there at North Fork. But then you're talking about water lines have been destroyed all along the way from here from there to Asheville. I believe they said they had to rebuild the roadbed on 70, which is like where the water is coming in from before they could even lay the pipes. Um, so when we started and like so when the water went out and I sort of won I thought that the water might go out personally after I knew that that the river was going to surge above the 2004 levels.
Right.
That was the only context that I had. So that was like pre-storm because it rained. One of the reasons that made this hurricane so much worse, which maybe people don't know, but like on Wednesday night, we had flooding then on a previous storm, and so I had driven around on Thursday and seen what was going on, and it was only going to rise higher from there. So um, anyway, like we kind of like identified that or like early on as being a possibility that water loss would happen. And then and now the quote, I think one of our first Instagram posts, our assistant city manager said there is no timeline, and we're not going to give you a timeline on when there will be a timeline. Um, at here at what we're calling the well AVL,
Mm-hmm.
we're operating on a 2 month
Wow.
time frame, and I think, and I'm talking, and that might be through for water through pipes. We are just making our best guesses based on the information that we don't have.
Hmm.
Um, but um, that would just be water through pipes, not to like a drinking, certainly not to a drinking water situation.
Right. What can you describe some of the problems that's causing, and maybe even more so for what communities it's causing those problems for most devastatingly? We've heard some reports from disabled communities, elderly communities whose caretakers have evacuated town. Um, yeah, I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts on that or any observations.
Yeah, so in what I've been doing, quite honestly, I just want to say that like I haven't been as much out
Hmm.
like direct in the community and just what I've been up to. But in terms of like and there are people all over who are like working to check on their neighbors and to um make sure they have what they need. But I mean, at the end of the day, you know, there's a second wave of loss that we could experience here from the public health crisis, which is looming.
Hmm.
Um, we are talking about a situation where we can experience diseases like cholera and dysentery. Um, and because of the lack of sanitation, um, until you live without water, you can't possibly conceptualize
Hmm.
how much water you need um, to, obviously wash dishes, wash clothing, and then, drinking water. Um, but and then for folks who are elderly and disabled, they need someone to physically flush their toilet.
Hmm.
Um, like the amount of care work that it's going to take for people to they can't lift these buckets and do those flushes. I know that there were drivers on our crew who were like giving people their first flush in 5 days.
Wow.
Um, and so that's a serious, serious problem. And I haven't independently verified this, but someone also has told me that like all a facility that produces 60% of IV bags for the entire US was wiped out here in the
Wow.
storm. And that is like, and it's affecting medical facilities all over the country. And like that IV bags are what we would need to treat
Right.
these
Hmm.
diseases. So the ripple effects are like it really sat with me. I think I was like, I've been trying to like stay focused on task, 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 but then when it sat with me that like one of these 275-gallon IBC totes that we're purchasing or that are floating around the community could flush like 70 people's toilets for one day.
Hmm.
The scale of that is just incredible.
Right.
And like that's why, you know, we have been like, okay, the people that were left behind before the storm are going to be left behind now. And like that's, and we, it's an impossible task for us to be able to completely meet all of the need as a community. And also like we can try to mitigate the harm and the ripple effects of this just like as best that we can.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I meant to ask this too about the historic things, so maybe we can do like revisit that for a minute and then also talk
Mhm.
about the current. In the previous water crises that Asheville experienced, are you aware of specific calls to action from the public to the government to address these? And of course, I would be curious how the government received those calls to action, or if they were responsive at all. And then, are there current calls to action now um, to the government regarding the water infrastructure, and are they being responsive to that at all?
Oh
If
gosh.
if you
Um,
know, and this may not be something that you,
well, I
uh,
mean, at the time, at the time with the previous water crisis, I was definitely sitting in the city council meetings after that, and it was actually really something I remember from that time is that there were actually like a lot of uh, people in the community who had expertise in this matter that were coming and speaking and like knew about how to respond. And actually at the time, people who'd done disaster response work were
hmm.
there, um, just like pointing out the failures of that. That had its moment, but like I don't see anything that has ultimately changed in terms of that. The when my cell phone didn't work in town, I got a text message that said that there was a curfew at 7:30 p.m., but not a text message about my water.
Wow,
Um,
yeah, right.
you know, and so there's that part. And in terms of like what our demands are now, I mean, I think quite frankly, just getting information. Well, I mean, information was a huge problem initially because we didn't have, cell phones, or we lost all connectivity at first.
Hmm.
Um, so that was a problem. But then ever since, it's like I used to listen to these, and we were all listening to the radio. This is how it was going in the beginning days. We were sitting in our car, or I would sit in parking lots where somebody would turn up the radio really loud, and we'd listen to these briefings from Buncombe County and Asheville City,
Hmm.
and like I, I, it just felt totally useless to me.
Hmm.
And we'd be like, "What? This is not helpful. What is the information?" I think it took them. I wish I knew the exact number of days it took before they even started distributing water, which the first site that Asheville started distributing was in the middle of downtown Asheville in like a commercial area.
Wow.
Um, and they were saying 1 gallon per person, or I forget, and like which is enough water for one person for one day. Um, and it took them a long time to even have water distribution happening on any level on their part. And it's never been mobile distribution,
Hmm.
which is like, I mean, if we're talking about people who are elders, disabled, or people who don't have transportation, we also didn't have gas initially.
Right.
That was a big problem. So like water was not getting to the people from the government officials. And the demands going forward is that, I mean, I hope that like the connections that we've made as a community throughout this come out of this with us demanding that like, hey, the people who actually have taken care of the city like get to
Yep.
decide
Yep.
more things in the
Right.
city. Because it has been us, and like we could have an opportunity to reevaluate our priorities. And I think that we're building power in our connections to one another. I have met hundreds of people over the past however many days this has been since the storm. And
Mm-hmm.
I hope that we continue that moment as, I'm sure Asheville will take a path, much like in other disaster zones, where people try to take advantage of the situation, do land grabs, etc., um, and talk about like meeting the needs of our community in the long term, and also how we can use the infrastructure that we're building now to do that as well. Like what, obviously without them,
Right.
because we don't trust. I don't have um, any level of trust with that.
Yeah, I mean, and that seems um, that seems to be what's the word I'm trying to think of? That makes sense, especially based on what you're telling us, or kind of what you perceived in the prior water crises. I mean, it's shocking to me what you were talking about with in 2004 with the Biltmore Village when they put in a backup line and just never replaced it with something more permanent. Um, yeah. Um,
And I think communities all over the country, this is another thing that I am just personally hoping that comes out of this. I've actually I've been interfacing with people these past couple of days who are actually like double hurricane, like who there are folks here who have connections to Asheville and to where like Milton hit,
right.
and just like the magnitude of that. Um, that like I hope that Asheville can be part of building models that we share with other communities as we shore up our connections for the inevitable response to climate change that we will be
Mm-hmm.
facing. That's something that I really hope does come out of this.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot as we've been visiting places and chatting with people and reading a lot of stuff, is that I think because of this sort of like historic neglect, governmental neglect in our region, and the sort of designation of our region as a site of extraction, more than a site of like dwelling, if you will, that our people, generally speaking, there's a broad distrust of the government, and um, there's one sense in which it's like a huge source of pride for me as an Appalachian person, that people did not wait. They were like, fuck this. Like, we're not waiting for the government to come along. We're just going to start taking care of our needs and the needs of our neighbors rapidly,
Absolutely.
and like watching that mobilization unfold, from a distance, those first 3 days was stunning. I mean, absolutely just like tragic, yes, and devastating, yes, and like there were so many complex emotions, but also I felt such enormous pride, I think, to see that. And I think
Same.
that my hope, as you said, would be that yeah, that this mobilization, this rapid kind of like mutual aid infrastructure building and connecting our pre-existing networks of community care can serve as a model. And I'm a little less inclined to think that this experience is going to wake people up more broadly to the need for these things throughout the U.S. and abroad. Um, but yeah, hopefully, at least with like-minded people, it kind of like, you know, fans the flame of like community care and mutual aid, building networks of community defense and things like that, which I think, as you said, will be much more needed moving forward. Um, well,
And that sentiment, can I touch
yeah,
on that a little bit?
absolutely.
Because that sentiment, I have heard from so many people.
Hmm.
It's difficult with such loss too to like also talk about, yeah, that we can hold many truths at once. But in some ways, like what I'm seeing right now in my community is like kind of the most beautiful thing that I've
Hmm.
ever experienced. And I'm hearing this from people over and over again. And there's also like this sentiment of like, this is like old Asheville is back. Like the the different little pockets of community, whether it's like mountain people with chainsaws, or there's even like sort of like hippie burner community that's been out like, serving food all day.
That's awesome.
There's like, yeah, and the bar flies. I mean, like the bar, like, yeah, the way that like people who go to like the local dive bars have like created this infrastructure from there. And then and the mutual aid like networks that we already had built before this. Um, that's sort of that feels very much something like that's been underlying Asheville, but that's been getting pushed out, particularly because of how expensive it's become. And like there have been a lot of people who came into town very recently who don't have ties to the community, who are now not here anymore. They had the resources to leave and they did. And then also this is the first time I've been in Asheville without tourists
Yeah,
in a
amazing.
very long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, while I was in Asheville the other day, I definitely got that vibe where it's like, wow, it feels like, the 2005 era, the early 2000 era here right now, where it's like just the sort of like true Ashevilleans left in a way. Like you don't have the property hawks around, you don't have the tourists around, you just have a bunch of weirdos trying to feed each other. And it's beautiful. Like it's like you said, it's a weird thing, and it does like, require me, or did require me to like hold like multiple truths at once, because I expected my visit to Asheville to feel very differently than it did. But I was able to connect with a lot of like-minded people, and also a lot of folks who are just like so engaged in the function of community care. And um, you know, it was very apparent that people are exhausted and that people are trying to work. I mean, this was a few days ago, but people were like working to find um, more sustainable ways to do the work, find more ways to add in rest rhythms to their work, knowing that this is going to be somewhat of a long haul, potentially quite a long haul. Um, but on top of that, there was just like an enormous amount of love, I think, within the community that I was feeling, and I was so thankful to have experienced that.
And it's proof, like a lot of time, I feel like when people talk, it seems like nowadays everyone's like, there's sort of this like apocalypse
Hmm.
talk that happens all the time. And like, oh, it's gonna get so crazy. And like they talk about it like everyone's gonna turn on each other.
Right,
And I'm like, no,
right.
the exact opposite is what
Hmm.
happens. I think that we internally know that this is how we should be living.
Hmm.
And that we need these connections. I've been at community dinner, and also like I've been on the receiving end of mutual aid in so many ways
Hmm.
too. Um, I've been going to community dinners. Somebody came and like volunteered. There've been people who've been doing like acupuncture and massage, like to
Hmm.
help us like stay regulated
Yeah.
and all of that. And it's just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, it does make sort of this kind of post-apocalyptic vibe that we're living in or moving into or whatever feel a little more hopeful. Obviously, yeah, there's a lot more to say on that. I'm gonna resist, but um, I do want to ask one kind of last question, um, specific to water and the community work that we're talking about.
Mhm.
Can you maybe give us an idea? We've heard a lot about the government neglect and inefficiencies after the storm, and prior to the storm, and how that's had detrimental impacts on the community in Asheville, or some of those detrimental impacts. Can you maybe explain or describe how you see the people of Asheville meeting those needs that the government isn't? And maybe you've already kind of hit on this, but maybe reiterating, what role you think those community infrastructures that are coming up, that are being developed now, what role they might play in Asheville's future.
Yeah, and maybe I could like bring it down a little bit to like even like where this like where what we're up to has started from
Yeah.
too, because I think that's somewhat how whatever work anyone's doing is, kind of started
Mm-hmm.
from, um, which is like basically, I guess the storm hit on.
I think your sound just cut out. I can't hear you. Do you see a little microphone icon? Yep. There you go.
Sorry, I hit my screen time limit for Instagram
Oh,
for the day.
sorry.
Um, but
That's healthy.
anyway, yeah. So anyway, as soon as the storm hit, like, and I heard this from a lot of other people too, like I started driving around to people's houses where I knew, where I knew where they lived, like once we didn't have connection and the storm was over. And then like there ended up being like we just started finding each other, and I was also just running into people on the street and being like, "Hey, are you okay?"
Mm-hmm.
And then on Saturday there ended up being a meeting at a local cooperatively owned bookstore here called Firestorm,
Mm-hmm.
where people were just sharing updates. And there ended up being these 2 p.m. meetings that were happening. And then a few days into that, that's when like this orientation towards the water part, was becoming more apparent that this was going to be a long timeline. And then we had like a 10 o'clock meeting where we all sat down and then tried to find other people, and it was like some people had gotten a well running off of a generator, and they started destroying water. Like there were already people who were already destroying water,
Mm-hmm.
and we just started like finding one another and thinking like about how we could do that and like most efficiently. I mean, it's difficult in a situation where obviously everyone needs water. Um, and so like we just started finding each other along the way, and there was like this beautiful, like I almost like picture like this web, like we talk about it, like this web that we just kept connecting the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
there's people who are doing that on in supplies. The chainsaw people found each other, you know the people who are physically flushing toilets,
Right.
and everyone found like started to find where they were going to be flowing into this, and then figuring out like how we can support each other and get each other what we need in all of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's amazing. Truly amazing. Um, cool. Well, I think that that's kind of covers the material that I wanted to cover today. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. I think this is a really important conversation, and I'll be watching closely as things evolve there as pertains to water infrastructure.
yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to tell these stories, because like I also hope that these stories are preserved and told.
Mm.
I'm sure we'll have our oral history as we always have.
Yep.
But I do appreciate it so much. It's such valuable work that y'all are doing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, trying to elevate and protect the stories of the people during this crisis feels so enormously important. I mean, we've already seen the state erasing those histories in some ways. It disgusts me. It makes me really angry, and I want to keep doing this work with good people who are on the ground surviving right now. So, yeah, we're sending you all the love and all the strength. I hope I can come visit Asheville again sometime soon. But
You're always welcome.
yeah, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Yep, bye.
Bye.